All right, welcome everybody. Just a few moments here while we get set up. We got to get our guest all organized. Heather Clarke.
Hello.
Hi, Heather.
Hi.
All right, we'll give everyone at least another minute before we kick things off. You're not wearing the hat today.
Well, no.
Maybe next time.
Maybe next time. Depends on what kind of a hair day I'm having.
Cool. All right. It's 1 o'clock. Let's get rolling. All right, everybody. Welcome to the Illumyx CultureCast. Thanks for joining us today. Before we get rolling, quick introduction about Illumyx and who we are and what we're doing. So we noticed just in the world today, the speed of business is just increasing and increasing and increasing with technology and competition and just market demands being placed on organizations. So what we do is we provide data to companies to really make informed decisions on how to get more focused, get faster as an organization, like particularly around decision making. And also how to get stronger. How do you build cohesion and trust and build stronger team cohesiveness and dynamics? And that translates to higher performing cultures. So we created the Illumyx CultureCast as a way for us, selfishly, to stay up to speed on what's the latest and greatest in the world of culture change. And so we bring experts on each month that are boots on the ground, doing work with leaders and teams and culture management as a way for us to learn and then for us to pass those learnings on to you. So a little bit of housekeeping before we get rolling. We do have a Q&A, probably the last 5 to 10 minutes that we're going to open up to you guys for questions. So if you have questions as we go through this discussion and this presentation, click the Q&A button on the bottom of the screen. You can submit your questions and we'll get to those later on in the show. So one quick announcement, I do have a behind the scenes guy with us today. His name is Dan Ritter. He's a culture specialist with Illumyx. He will be moderating the discussion. So if you hear a disembodied voice coming in at some point, that is Dan. It is not a ghost. Let's see. And yeah, so today's topic is called influencing without authority. And whenever you're dealing with culture change, you're dealing with broad organizational change, and most people you interact with, at least in my experience, you don't have direct positional authority over. So it requires a lot of really sound people skills and just technical skills around how to manage change. So we brought on one of my favorite leadership coaches that I've known for quite some time, Heather Clarke, to talk to us about this today in terms of how she deals with leaders and works with leaders to exact change, not only with their teams, but across their organization. So Heather's the founder and executive coach with HC Coaching and Training, and she's also a senior exec coach with Epiphany Coaches, which is a massive coaching firm based out of Toronto. So Heather, thanks for joining us today.
You're very welcome. I'm thrilled to be here.
Cool. Before we get rolling, tell us a little bit about your background and how you got into executive coaching.
Okay. I started out in social services, interestingly enough. And as I was working with more and more business people in the area in which I was working, I realized that about 95% of their business issues were around people and communication skills and getting people together and influencing people, which was right along the lines of things that I was passionate about. And so, so that just led me to meeting some really key people in my life that led me to coaching. And so now I've been coaching. Actually, this is my 20th year officially as a coach.
Oh, wow. It's like almost guru status at that point. and give our viewers like a taste for like kind of the types of companies you've worked with, either in the past, currently. Are they small, big, everything in between?
So interestingly enough, I work with all sizes of companies. I've worked with 3-person teams and companies that are just starting out and wanting to grow their business. So bringing them together to actually decide what they want their culture to be, and working on that, and how do we show up as leaders to create that culture. And I've worked with multinational organizations, huge tech firms, with people all over the world. So I do a combination of one-on-one coaching with leaders and also team coaching in organizations to try to basically improve the culture and drive business impact through the people development.
Okay, very cool. Well, let's take a look at the agenda and what we're going to cover today. Because we've had a couple conversations when I reached out to you. I was like, all right, Heather, I want to have you on this show. Just don't know quite exactly what we're going to talk about. What are some ideas? And this is what we came up with. So in our discussions, we talked about 4 common leadership issues you commonly encounter as an executive coach. We're going to do our best to hit all 4. Due to time, we may only hit 3 based on how the conversation goes. You also asked me to pull up any data indicators that we have through that represents how some of these issues might unfold, or how you might have them. So I'll interject some of those indicators as time permits. We'll talk through some models. Actually, you'll be presenting a couple of different models and how to address some of these issues, and provide some context for people around how some of this stuff works. And then we'll also be touching on just what are some methods and approaches so you can act as an internal coach to other leaders in your organization to exact change.
Great.
Did I cover everything, Heather?
I think so.
All right, cool. Well, before we get into some of the meaty stuff, I got to ask, like, why? So this might seem like a super obvious question, but why is it important to influence people?
Well, it's interesting. I was reading an article recently, and they had this, I'm going to paraphrase because I didn't actually write the quote down, but it talked about the ability to positively influence people creates willing participants as opposed to reluctant followers. And, I would say that in the scenarios in which I work, there's all sorts of opportunities for people in all positions of the organization to have influence. Whether you're a CEO influencing your team, or you're a marketing exec influencing your sales partners, or you're a frontline employee influencing your manager. Influence is a very, very significant skill set and can really impact the culture of an organization, both positively and negatively.
I like that concept of creating willing participants.
Yeah.
I know personally, I've probably led a few initiatives or probably dragged a few people along. Not necessarily proud of those moments.
You have a certain amount of people dragging, but you want the majority kind of coming along willingly, or at least trusting you a little bit.
Okay, so willing partners. Which brings me to my next thing. Many times, maybe this is just my own confusion, I can mix up the concepts of influence versus control. I don't say more about that. How do you interpret the differences in terms of the work that you do?
So I had a great example of that actually on a call this morning, where I have a high-level marketing exec that is trying to influence the actions of a sales team. And we got talking about the fact that, influence is about getting people to come up with their own action plan, right? That, like, they've convinced themselves that they have bought in, and they have some control. They're coming to the table with their own plan, as opposed to, I consider controlling basically just telling people what to do and how to do it.
Okay. So if you're looking at change, like I like that definition around getting people to come up with their own plan, because then that change is more self-sustaining, self-starting, more organic. Okay.
Yeah.
Excellent. Well, let's get into some of these topics. So the first thing that you brought up to me was this issue of change management being, I'll just say, a growth area for many leaders that you work with. So talk us through how you see leaders struggling through change management and the impact that it has on their organizations and teams?
Okay. Well, it's for any organization that is experiencing any sort of growth or any changes, it impacts them. And I'll give you an example. I was working with a medium-sized organization, about 100 people, a while ago, and they went through a series of mergers and acquisitions and became a very large organization, actually over 1,000 people. And the senior leadership team, of course, had been working behind the scenes confidentially for all the right reasons for years, literally, to make this change happen. They had a vision. They felt that the organizations were pretty aligned culturally, and they were really committed to creating an exciting future for the people in their organizations and impacting the world. And so then they were all set and they bought in, and then they announced the change to their employees, and this is what we're going to do, and this is so exciting, and oh, isn't this great? And they were completely baffled that everyone wasn't excited as they were. You know, in fact, some people actually left the organization because they didn't want to, you know, they didn't see the vision. And that is so common, right? That the behind the scenes, people are working on change for a long period of time, and they've adapted to the idea of the change. And then when they announce it, they forget that actually most people don't like change. You know, stats kind of show that about 90% of the population does not like change. They like the status quo. They distrust, you know, maybe the direction that the leaders are taking them, or they feel excluded from how decisions are being made. And they really aren't excited as the leaders would like them to be.
Now, I wonder if there's any stats on like executives, like if they're, I don't know, more open to change, or is it just that they're more in control or in charge of the process?
Great point. I think for most, some are excited about change. Like about 10% of the population loves change, and those are often the people that are running organizations, right? So they're naturally drawn to change, and that's why they have a really hard time understanding people that don't like change. And to your point, they're in control. Right? So they've already kind of gone through their own ups and downs with the change personally. And by the time they're ready to announce it to the team, they're bought in. They're already at the late stages of change management.
Okay. Well, in our discussions, you introduced me to a model called the Satir model, and we can pull that up right now. And you said you commonly use this in your coaching engagements. I'd like you to talk us through this model and how it works, and well, we'll let you go from there.
All right. The reason I love this model, and there's a lot of change models out there, and I have used some different ones, but the reason I love this model is because it's simple. And it really, I've used it with teams. I've used it with like C-level executive teams, and I've used it with shop floor teams in a manufacturing plant. And everybody gets it. And one of the important parts about when we're looking at change in an organization is actually just normalizing that part of the change process is it's going to get messy. So, you know, to your point about where executives are at when they announce change, you know, everybody else is at the late status quo, the very beginning stages of change. They know it's like, this is the way we've always done things around here. People are comfortable. They know what to expect. They know how to react. They know how to behave. And even in a company where the status quo maybe isn't the greatest, the culture isn't greatest, at least it's predictable. And in the story that I shared about this big M&A situation, each of those three companies that were involved were, they all had their own separate cultures and their own separate kind of code of conduct way of being together that they were comfortable with. So all of a sudden you hit them with the foreign element, right? Which is any change that rocks their world and threatens their stability. And so in this particular case, we took three distinct cultures, which happened to all be in different geographic locations, including different countries. And we told them, surprise, you're getting a new culture. You're going to be one big happy family. And so naturally what happens for human beings in general when we experience change is we resist it because we fear the new and the unknown. And we might not understand the need for change. We might just not want to change. We might blame other people for causing problems or, that have led to the change. And so this is a really challenging time for the organization. And in the example of this large organization that I was working with, resistance sometimes showed up as people just continuing to work as if they still worked for their old company, continuing to just be in their silos and keep doing what they were doing. And it was kind of like a passive resistance, but it was a resistance.
Kind of like if we ignore it, maybe everything will just go back.
Yeah, it'll go away and they'll forget this crazy idea of creating this large organization. And this is where it's really key to really, as a leadership team, to identify the influencers in the organization. Because influencers come in all shapes and sizes, in all job areas. They don't need a leadership title to be an influencer. And this is where it's really key to kind of identify those influencers.
So you're saying in step 2, the resistance stage, identify influencers to begin disseminating your message or whatever that might be.
Yeah. And if they're, and that's where the work can really take off. The next stage is chaos. And what I love about this is when I'm working with organizations, I just say, this is where you're probably at now and it's normal. There's going to be chaos. There's going to be lots of reactions to the change. There's people that feel like they've lost their identity and their belonging. They feel anxious. They feel vulnerable. They fear, right? What happens? We hear in the news all the time when there's mergers and acquisitions, everybody gets fired. And so there's a lot of fear and chaos at this stage. And from an organizational perspective, this is where they see a huge decrease in performance.
Okay.
Yeah, huge. So it really impacts the bottom line of an organization. So even though it's a normal part of the change process, it's one of the parts where you want to try to move through it, as quickly as you possibly can in order to kind of get people back on board and back producing and feeling secure.
Now, Heather, have you ever encountered a situation where there wasn't a dip in performance? Or is it just mitigating the dip?
Never. There's always a dip in performance, right? Because, part of it sometimes is, I'll give you an example. I'm working with an organization right now that is introducing a new computer system, right? So this is a huge change for people learning to use a new system. And so the most proficient of the order desk people that are really good at their jobs are struggling because they're still not good at their jobs. It's because they're learning new skills, right? So automatically their performance is going to drop a bit just until they get back on board and learn the new system.
So what's this transforming idea I see?
So the transforming idea, it's kind of like that moment when people get it, right? That moment when they understand where the company's going, that moment where they start to feel secure, that moment where maybe they can even get excited about new possibilities. I know in the one big M&A project I was working with, at this moment, we had people that actually were interested in moving and changing geographic locations to get a different experience or take on some new responsibility. So it's like this tipping point in Malcolm Gladwell's book, Tipping Point. There's just this moment. And as an organization, you gather momentum and you start to see any of the final resistors kind of getting on board.
Now, are there any things you'd recommend not doing? Like if you're a leader that would maybe impede getting to that transformative idea
Mm.
to actually happen and bubble to the top, so to speak?
Yeah, I was thinking about this, and one of the things that leaders will often try to do is smooth the way through the chaos,
Mm.
right? And actually, that can stall the process by trying to smooth everything out. And so, my recommendation when they're in that stage is to really listen. Listen to what's going on, listen to what people are concerned about, listen to what they're anxious about. And support them to understand the vision. Maybe they need a bit more communication. Maybe they need a bit more training. So as a part, opposed to just kind of, brushing their concerns aside, it's actually really, really listening.
Okay. I like that. And it almost has like a therapeutic tone to it, just sort of like, hey, let's just hear you out. We're not going to fix the problems per se, but
Yeah,
we'll get
yeah,
your questions answered and alleviate some of those concerns. So that
yeah.
the feelings don't get built up and kind of carried
Mm.
as resentment.
For sure. And then, through that process, then we hit integration. And what integration is really all about is, again, people all of a sudden seeing that there's this new way of being can really benefit them. So it's kind of that what's in it for me. Up until then, they're concerned, they're fearful, they're not sure where they fit in anymore. They may have been really competent in their own old position and really confident, and they're just finding their way. And at the integration stage is usually when people find their way. They maybe see new opportunities for growth and development. Maybe they've got the training and they've got that new computer system, kind of down pat, and they're back up to speed in their own minds. And that's when, again, your influencers have a huge part to play in helping support people to get to this phase. And they're demonstrating new skills themselves, and they're also really kind of being cheerleaders for other people to help them move more quickly to this stage.
Okay,
And then
so
finally, you're kind of in your new status quo, right? Which is then now all of a sudden, this is how we do things, right? And people often look back on the chaos and go, oh, wow, that didn't seem so bad now.
but I work with companies where, I mean, they look back, maybe there's a new status quo, or maybe they've gone back to the late state status quo. You can maybe help me determine it, where, I mean, they still carry like resentment and a lot of pain and baggage from change that happened like 3-4 years ago. So would that be a new status quo, or is that really a company that didn't really effectively navigate through the changes and they're still actually back at the late status quo?
Yeah, good point. Is that, when you're in the chaos, it is challenging to get to the other side. And there are companies that can't handle the chaos stage, and they do go back.
Okay.
Because it's more comfortable, and maybe some of their key people aren't on board, and they fear, again, the company fears losing those key people. They think they can't kind of live without them. And so for sure, there are lots of organizations that don't make it up the other side.
Cool. I just noticed we got a quick question I'm going to address.
Okay.
How long do organizations typically spend in the chaos stage?
Good question. It really depends. I mean, the big M&A project that I worked on, whenever I'm working with an organization in general, I always say it's a change is a 5 to 7 year process, depending on the organization. And in a smaller organization, I would say 2 to 5 years. And I had one gentleman, lovely man, he was in his 70s, owned a small manufacturing plant in the agricultural industry. And he was referred to me by another business friend of his. And when I met with him the first time and he told me what changes he wanted to make in the organization, the first question I always ask is, are you prepared for 2 to 5 years of chaos? And he's like, this isn't going to take 2 years. Oh, we'll have it done in 6 months. So we agreed to start working together. And it was almost 2 years to the day that he got the organization to where he needed it, because his goal was to sell and retire. And we're sitting in his office, and he reminded me, he goes, "Do you remember sitting here 2 years ago, Heather, when you told me it was going to take 2 to 5 years, and I told you were full of crap?" He goes, "I take it all back."
Hey, they eventually come around. It's cool.
They did.
Well, let's switch gears, because when I look at this model, and especially in the chaos phase, I see in my experience a lot of blame happens. People stop working together. The decision-making process gets dysfunctional as maybe people withdraw and go into their silos. And it's something I also see that we talked about is this concept of micromanagement, that leaders then feel that anxiety and that stress, and then they get more involved in the day-to-day than they typically would be. So I want to talk to me a little bit about your experience with leaders in micromanagement and how you work with them.
Yeah, so I have a couple of leaders right now I'm working with that, again, the reason they're in the position they're in is because either their company or their division has grown, which is a great thing. That's a great problem to have. And the challenge is when an organization or a division is small, the leader has the ability to have their hands on everything. They know everybody, they make the decisions. And as it grows, they really need to rely on others to lead, which means two things happen for them. One, they no longer know everything, which can really impact their sense of self-worth to the team, because they have to figure out a new way of operating. And they need to learn to delegate and rely on others. And for some people, that's really challenging. They literally do not know how to delegate.
So, okay, I like that. So their competency is challenged, their identity is challenged, and then they're in a position of not having to know everything. Now, I talked about stress being a driver. So then, are there other drivers behind that behavior that outside of those two things you just mentioned that you typically see?
Yeah, I think there's probably many causes, many things that cause people to micromanage. I know, some leaders I work with say, "I'm a perfectionist. I can do it better and faster myself." They don't do it the way I would. I have one young leader I'm working with right now, and we talked about, is it the end result that's the most important, or is it that they follow the same process as you would to get to the end result? Right. And so, for the leader, it's about wrestling with that question and that perfectionism and what is good enough when it comes to having somebody else do something. For some people, it's really the inability to trust, whether it's just that they have a new team or just that sometimes people have a hard time trusting other people. And in some cases, they just really need to work through their own trust issue. In order to help them to dive in and try to work with other people and trust that other people can do the work or will do it. Maybe not the same as them, but they'll get it done. And as I said, some people just really don't know how to delegate. So then there's kind of working through that. How do you do that well?
Yeah, so I'll pull up some data right now around, because you asked me to look at, is there any corroborating data that we can find in our system or that would indicate micromanaging behavior? And we found some cool stuff, actually. It's more of an illustrative loop that we found that when leaders micromanage. And the first thing we typically find, I think that's really in line with what you're saying, is leaders then, for whatever reason, override decision-making authority with their employees. So like you said, they don't do it the same way I would, or that decision's not the same I would have made, so then I'm going to override it. And then this translates to actually a lot of confusion and uncertainty around what decisions employees can or can't make, which then creates this belief that the leader is responsible for all decisions, which then creates this other dynamic where employees then avoid making decisions, and it's this vicious cycle. And where once micromanagement behavior happens, it just gets worse and worse and worse.
Yeah.
So when you're coaching these leaders, like, how do you start impacting this in the right direction?
Well, really, I dig into what's going on for them, right? As far as their inability, I actually had a session with a young gentleman I'm coaching right now. He's actually in charge of a $75 million project, so he's been
Whoa.
given a lot of responsibility, and yet he doesn't have any direct reports. So his whole ability, or what he needs to be able to do, is influence the teams of other people that are working on this. It's a construction project. So he's got internal teams, he's got external subcontracting teams. And we talked about him trying to delegate, and the person didn't follow through on what he wanted him to do. And I said, why do you think that was? Did you ask him? Why do you think that was? And he said, I think that he just doesn't care as much as I do. And so I said to him, well, there's usually two reasons why people don't do what you ask them to do. One is they don't care, which is their issue. There's not much you can do about that except try to connect them with caring. And the other one is you haven't done a good job of communicating, which is your issue, right? And and so with him, we're actually co-creating a delegation template. And for him, he goes, this is just silly. Like, I know how to give jobs away. And I said, well, you might know how to, but obviously something's wrong in the communication with the other person. And so the template is as much for them as it is actually for you, so that you can be really clear on what your expectations are and what your timelines are and what the level of responsibility that the person has. Because you're absolutely right. Some people will take on a task and they'll exceed their level of authority, and then they get in trouble, which then is a vicious cycle. Well, I don't want to take on more responsibility if I'm just going to get in trouble if I make a mistake.
That makes sense. How do you get them to trust or start exploring that, or trust their employees more? Because that seems to be a core issue.
So one of the questions I ask is, what does trust look like? And really get the leader to dig into what trust looks like for them. Because we tend to have different ways we trust. Some of us trust until somebody burns us. So we kind of trust unconditionally, like, you've got my trust until you burn me. For other people, trust is a long process. And so another question I'll ask them is, how would I know that we now have a trusting relationship? What does that look like? What am I going to get from you that lets me know that you now trust me? And that question inevitably helps them to understand and be able to articulate what that looks like for them. And then I ask them to share that with the people that they need to influence.
Oh, so it's not just this intellectual exercise. They actually have
Oh, no.
Team.
No, you need to do something with it now.
Okay. I could see how that might make some leaders uneasy.
Conversations. You need to come back with some report on the action you took.
Okay. No, that's really interesting. I wonder if we can transition to another common issue where you talked about leaders really struggling articulating a clear vision and set of expectations for their employees, which actually probably perfectly segues into micromanagement behavior. So talk to us about how you experience that.
Yeah, so it absolutely does, because often, kind of going back to what we started talking about, where a leader has a vision for where they want to be, sometimes they're not really that good at articulating it. And also maybe putting it in language that to share with people that demonstrates the impact that it's going to have on those people. Right. So, people can get really excited about their own vision. I've got a gentleman, I just was on a call with him today. He's from the UK, and he's a senior marketing manager for Europe for a US-based software company. And he has this great vision and this growth strategy for building business in Europe. And he's getting the challenge is that he's getting feedback from his European clients that they're not happy with the support services for the software, and all the support people are in the US. And he does not directly manage those people. However, those people have a huge amount of power and influence in his business results. And so if he's going to be successful, he has to figure out how to influence those people and how to share his vision and how to create a set of expectations around how they need to perform. And the reality is they don't report to him. So his job now is to work with their manager. He needs their manager on his side to understand his vision and to understand how she fits in, her success fits in with that vision. And her success is what he needs to key in on, because the residual effect of that will be his success.
So kind of like the what's in it for me piece, articulating that
Absolutely.
to her. Okay.
Yeah, for sure.
Is he supposed to know that intuitively, or is it more of a conversation? Like, how do you go about that?
Yeah, it's absolutely a conversation. And this same gentleman, one of his key drivers is providing value, and which is really cool. And yet, one of the things I asked him was, how do you know if you're providing value? And he said, oh, good question. I think I'm providing value. And I said, well, did you ask the person what value would look like for them? And he's like, oh, I forgot that step. So really, like, for him to work with her, he needs to ask her, what does success look like for you? Like, what excites you about working with your team to increase our European business? And try to figure out, try to have that conversation with her and be really direct and transparent and candid. Yeah.
Well, that sounds like good business advice, but also just good relationship advice if anyone's in a relationship, married or dating.
Yeah. Sometimes we forget to just ask the question. Don't make assumptions.
I used to give my wife back massages all the time and thinking that was what she wanted. And she's just like, find out how I'm doing. Oh, okay.
Exactly.
Well,
I heard a great saying, and I love this saying. It's, and I'm probably not saying it correctly, but we see the world as we are, not as it is, right? So we view the world through our own lens, and we make assumptions that everybody else has that same lens. And so we do a lot of behaviors and operate a lot just from our own perspective. And sometimes we just forget to simply ask the question, what was it that I didn't communicate? Where was the miscommunication, right? As opposed to, why didn't you do that the way I told you? It's like, what happened? What happened that prevented you from being successful in doing that?
So I got a couple more questions for you. So on this area, so what are some indicators for leaders? Like, because for me personally, I run like 100 miles an hour, and sometimes I would just say lack awareness. So what are some indicators for you when you working with leaders that they need to slow down and get refocused on communicating clear vision and clear expectations?
So, some indicators are, a team that's struggling, for no apparent reason. Then there's, you need to stop and figure out the struggle. When the team's in a chaos stage, as opposed to, like we talked about, smoothing it over, you need to stop and ask some questions and dig in. And in coaching, we have a term, it's called asking questions for which you have no answer. Right? So you're literally, you're not making an assumption about the answer that you're going to get. You're truly listening. And somebody was just telling me about Ed Beisters. I don't know if I'm saying that right, but he's a mountaineer that's climbed the 14 tallest peaks in the world. And he has a book called No Shortcut to the Top. And he talks about when he's near the top of the mountain, that every step he has to stop for 15 seconds to catch his breath. And even though he can see the top of the mountain, he has to go that slowly if he wants to actually reach the top of the mountain. And he emphasized that as a climber, you have to listen to the mountain. The mountain is communicating to you. The mountain is giving you signs and feedback about what the conditions are and how you're doing and whether there's snow coming. And I love that analogy in an organization. You literally have to listen to the mountain and slow down enough to really listen to what's going on and not make assumptions about what you think is going on.
Which actually brings me to my next question around like is there a cadence, like how often like leaders need to communicate vision and expectations? Like is it like 17 times a month? Is it twice a year? Like what's the frequency, if there is any?
Yeah, I would say as often as possible, right? And in different kinds of conversations, because your job as a leader is constantly connect people to the vision. So if you're working with somebody or you're giving a salesperson feedback and they've done some really great things, it's not only giving them the feedback on what they've done, it's saying, hey, and that's helping us to reach, remember that goal we talked about, remember that vision? What you're doing in your role right now is helping us get there. It's as simple as that. Okay.
Well, we got about 5 minutes left, and I'm seeing some questions pile up. Okay. So Dan, if you're there, if you could.
Hi, everyone. This is Dan. Yeah, I've got a good question here. Going back to the micromanaging, question around what to do if you're being micromanaged. So how do people being managed help leaders understand that they don't need to micromanage? And how can you influence a leader above you if you don't have legitimate power?
Right. Love it. So this is common. And one of the things that I talk to clients about in this area is around actually really sitting down with that manager and being a little bit candid and brave and courageous with them and just letting them know when this is happening, it seems like you don't trust me. That's kind of the feeling that I'm getting. And so can we talk about what that looks like? Do you need more communication from me? Can we set up a check-in plan, right? So you're giving the person the feedback, because there's a lot of people that are really not that self-aware. They don't really understand the impact that they're having on other people. And it really takes, I love that question because people can influence their managers. Managers are people too, and they actually don't know it all. And they don't have all the skills that they need to be a good manager. And they really actually need a strong team and courageous people like that to step up and say, I don't think you intend to have this impact on me, but this is the impact that you're having. And how can we work together to change that?
All right, I think we've got time for another question. So here's a question from a new leader who wants to move quickly. And what's your advice for a new leader who wants to really quickly develop trust and influence with their team?
Good one. This may sound really, really simplistic, but get to know your team. Get to know who they are, create a vision, get to know how they operate, let them know who you are and how you operate. I'll give you an example. I have a young gentleman I have worked with, and he was the top salesperson. And so they put him in a leadership role because he was the top salesperson. And he was great as a salesperson, and as a leader, he really wasn't doing that well. And he was leading people that he knew, so it wasn't like it was a new team. He was just in a different position. And I sat with him and I said, what made you a great salesperson? He said, well, I knew, their partners' names and their kids' names, and I knew where they went on vacation, and I'd use that as my starting point when I was working with them or went to visit them. And I said, so, Joe's sitting out there, do you know if he has a partner? Oh, how about Sally? Does she have any kids? Do you know their names? What about Sam over there? When was the last time he went on vacation and where did he go? And he went, shit, and it's, sorry, there's no, right? And he was like, he had the skills, to be that great leader and to really build trust quickly and build relationship quickly with his team, he just forgot that he needed to use it with his team. And he was able to turn that situation around super quickly. Yeah.
Excellent. Well, thank you for those questions. I'm afraid that's all the time we have for the question and answer section. So I'm sorry if we didn't get to everybody's question, but hopefully you got some good answers from the ones we did get to address.
Cool. Yeah, and Heather, thank you so much for coming on today. I learned a lot. Definitely have some new awarenesses and maybe some things I should look at going forward. If people want to get in touch with you, what's the best way? Is it through LinkedIn, through Facebook, shoot you an email, give me a phone call?
Yeah, so yeah, you can connect with me through LinkedIn, or if I don't know if you have a slide there with my email and phone number on it, for sure. Yeah, give me a shout, either by phone or through email, and would love to connect.
Cool. Yeah, and be sure to reach out to Heather. She's a great resource. There were a couple questions too, so we may even see if we can answer those offline that we didn't get to. Before we wrap up though, quick plug for our next show. I'm having a guest on from Boulder, Colorado next month, May 22nd. Her name is Dana Dupuis. She's the owner of the Echo Listening Profile and also runs a company called Brio Enterprises. So she's going to talk to us about the topic of the business of listening. And she also has a free gift for anyone who registers and attends. So that's going to be May 22nd, 11 a.m. Central Time. So we'll get registration information out to you guys shortly. So anyways, thanks for listening this month. And we appreciate everything. And we'll see you next month. Take care.